Welcome to Reveal Fears. Subscribe and like this video.
Part 1. The Gate to Nowhere. I remember the gate vividly. It was a rusted iron arch that stood at the end of a long dirt path, its once ornate design twisted and broken, as if it had been gnawed on by time itself. Beyond it stretched an impenetrable mist that seemed to cling to the earth like a shroud. The locals called it the Hollow Veil, though no one could tell you exactly why. I wasn't a local, though. I was an investigator, drawn by the stories of strange disappearances and whispered legends of people who ventured beyond the gate and never returned. My memory of that day is fractured, like shards of a broken mirror. Even now, recounting it feels like trying to hold on to sand slipping through my fingers. I remember parking my car at the edge of the woods. The road ended abruptly, swallowed by nature's relentless creep. The air felt heavy, almost wet, like a storm was perpetually brewing just over the horizon. I had brought a flashlight, a journal, and my camera, though only the flashlight remains. The gate seemed alive. I don't mean that it moved, it was utterly still, but standing before it, I felt like I was being watched. There was a faint, almost imperceptible hum emanating from it, like the low vibration of a distant power line. It beckoned, pulling me forward in a way I couldn't resist. I stepped through. What struck me first was the silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of my own breathing. It was as if the world itself had been muted. The mist curled around my legs, cold and damp, and the path beneath my feet dissolved into a strange black soil that seemed to swallow my footprints as I walked. The first mile was uneventful. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the mist, illuminating gnarled tree trunks and patches of wild grass. But then I saw it, something glimmering faintly in the distance. I approached cautiously, heart pounding, and discovered a silver bracelet half buried in the dirt. It was engraved with a name. Lila. That name tugged at something deep in my subconscious, though I couldn't place it at the time. I pocketed the bracelet, thinking it might be a clue to one of the missing persons. It wasn't until much later that I realized the bracelet was just the first breadcrumb on a path that would lead me to the edge of sanity. Part 2. The Cries in the Mist. The further I walked, the thicker the mist became. My flashlight, once a reliable companion, now barely cut through the oppressive grayness. The air carried a strange metallic tang, faint but unmistakable, like the scent of rusted iron. I had been following what seemed like a trail, but it was growing harder to discern. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth, and I noticed something unsettling. There were no twigs snapping, no crunch of leaves underfoot. It felt like the ground wasn't made of earth at all, but something yielding, like skin stretched tight over bone. And then I heard it. A sound pierced the silence, a faint, childlike cry, carried on the air like a whisper. It stopped me in my tracks. The sound was distant, almost dreamlike, but it sent a cold jolt through my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding alien in the silence. The cry didn't answer. It was faint but unmistakable now, a soft wailing, like someone, or something, lost. I pressed on, heart thudding like a drum. The cries grew louder as I walked, but their direction never seemed to change. They always felt just out of reach, coming from somewhere deeper in the mist. And then I found something else. A shoe. Small, muddy, and worn at the edges, it lay abandoned on the path. I crouched to pick it up, my flashlight revealing faint scuff marks in the dirt where it had been dragged. It was a child's shoe, and not far from it was another object, a frayed blue ribbon tangled around a branch. I wasn't alone. The cries suddenly stopped, cut off as if by a blade. The silence rushed back in, thicker and heavier than before. I stood there, the shoe in one hand and the flashlight in the other, straining my ears. Then something moved. A shadow, tall, elongated, and wrong, flickered in the edge of my vision. I spun, shining the beam of my flashlight into the mist, but there was nothing. Just an empty path stretching behind me. The mist grew colder. My breath came out in faint puffs of vapor, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift ever so slightly, as though it were alive. and then the cries returned. But this time, they were closer. Part 3. The smell of decay. The cries weren't just close, they were everywhere. They echoed in the mist, overlapping, warbling, as if a dozen voices were wailing at once. My pulse quickened, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. But something, curiosity or hubris, pushed me forward. I crept along the path, every step deliberate, careful. The flashlight trembled in my grip. The beam darted across the trees, the mist, and the unnaturally black ground. But the cries stopped again as quickly as they had started. What replaced them was worse. A smell rolled over me, thick and nauseating. It was a pungent mix of rotting meat and damp earth. I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve, but it was no use. The stench clung to the air, heavy and suffocating. That's when I saw the pile. Just ahead, my flashlight caught a mound of something unnatural. My first thought was that it was debris, maybe branches or animal remains. But as I drew closer, the shape became sickeningly clear. It was a heap of shoes. Hundreds of them, all sizes and styles, many caked in mud, others shredded as if by claws. Some were tiny, like they belonged to children, others were sturdy boots or scuffed sneakers. A few were pristine, eerily out of place. My stomach turned, and I stumbled back. I couldn't look away, though. Something about the pile was wrong, beyond just the obvious horror. It took a moment to realize what it was. The shoes weren't scattered. They were arranged, almost deliberately, in a crude spiral pattern. Then I noticed the second pile. This one was off to the side, barely visible in the fog. Smaller, but unmistakable. My legs felt like lead as I approached it, the smell of decay growing stronger with each step. Bones. They were old, brittle, and bleached white. Most were broken, as if gnawed on, and scattered haphazardly. But the skulls, they were all intact. Small and round, human, with dark, empty eye sockets staring blankly into the mist. I felt bile rise in my throat. A faint rustling noise came from behind me. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the gray. There was nothing there, but I could feel it, something watching me, hidden just beyond the edge of the light. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. No answer. And then I felt it, a soft, almost imperceptible tug at the back of my coat, like a child pulling for attention. I turned so fast I nearly fell, the flashlight whipping through the air. But there was nothing. Just the mist, the trees, and that unbearable silence. But I knew something had touched me. Part 4. The handprints. My legs screamed at me to run, but my mind was paralyzed. Something had touched me, I was certain of it. The tug on my coat was faint, but unmistakable. Slowly, I turned in a full circle, the flashlight beam jittering as my trembling hand swept the mist. Nothing. The silence pressed down on me, thick and oppressive. Even my own breathing seemed muffled. My flashlight fell on the ground, and that's when I saw them. Handprints. They were faint at first, scattered in the black soil like ghostly impressions. But as I swept the beam further, more of them emerged. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of small, childlike handprints pressing into the earth as though they'd been crawling, no, clawing, their way toward me. I stumbled back, my boots sinking into the soft ground. The handprints weren't just on the ground. They were on the trees. Smudges of dirt streaked the trunks, some high up, others close to the ground. It was as if something had scaled the bark, dragging muddy fingers over the surface. My light caught a patch where the streaks were fresher, still damp and glistening. The metallic tang in the air thickened. My stomach churned, and the nauseating smell of decay flared again, stronger than before. It wasn't coming from the bones or the shoe pile anymore. It was coming from the mist itself, as though the very air was rotting around me. And then I heard the laughter. Soft, brittle, and childlike, it broke the silence like glass shattering. It wasn't joyful, it was mocking, high-pitched and distorted, echoing from somewhere deep in the mist. My flashlight beam darted wildly, chasing shadows that seemed to flicker just out of reach. "Stop it!" I yelled, though my voice sounded small and weak against the void. The laughter cut off, replaced by a single sound. A whisper. "Leave!" The voice was barely audible, but it was there, as if someone had spoken it directly into my ear. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. My light swept over the trees, catching on something, a fleeting movement, like a figure darting behind a trunk. "Who's there?" I shouted again, the desperation cracking my voice. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, in the dirt, I saw something that nearly made me drop the flashlight. A fresh handprint. It hadn't been there moments ago, I was sure of it. The impression was so sharp, the fingers so distinct, that it might as well have been pressed into wet cement. It was smaller than the others. Tiny. Child-sized. My light traced forward, following a trail of new prints that stretched ahead, deeper into the mist. I didn't want to follow them. Every instinct screamed for me to turn back, to run. But something, curiosity, fear, or something darker, kept my feet moving. The prints stopped at the edge of a clearing. In the center, there was a single object standing upright. My heart clenched when I saw what it was. A child's teddy bear, soaked and dripping with something dark. Part 5: The Teddy Bear. The bear stood upright in the clearing, its fur matted and darkened as though it had been left to rot in the rain. Its glassy eyes reflected the beam of my flashlight, creating tiny pinpricks of light in the overwhelming grayness. I approached cautiously, each step slower than the last. The ground beneath me seemed to grow softer, almost spongy, as if it resented my presence. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air, and the silence around me felt unnatural, almost intentional. When I was close enough, I crouched to examine the bear. It was soaked, its fur clung to its stuffed body, dripping something thick and black. For a moment, I thought it was just mud, but the closer I looked, the more I realized it wasn't. It was blood. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. My breath caught, and I recoiled, stumbling back. The bear toppled over with a wet squelch, and I noticed something half buried beneath it. A photograph. With shaking hands, I picked it up. The edges were torn, and the surface was smeared with dirt, but the image was still clear. It was of a little girl, no older than 6 or 7, standing in front of a large oak tree. She was smiling, her head tilted slightly to the side, holding the same teddy bear now lying at my feet. The back of the photograph was blank except for one word, scrawled in uneven, childish handwriting. Lila. My heart pounded. I remembered the bracelet I had found earlier, the name engraved on it. The girl's face seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. That's when the laughter returned. It came from the trees surrounding me, circling like a predator stalking its prey. It was high-pitched, broken, and wrong, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. Lila? I called out, my voice trembling. The laughter stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, and then a sound I'll never forget, a low, guttural growl that didn't belong to any human or animal I'd ever heard. It came from behind me. I turned slowly, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The mist seemed to part, revealing something standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall and hunched, its figure blurred by the fog. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, black pits that seemed to drink in the light, were fixed directly on me. My legs locked in place. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took a single step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on frayed strings. The photograph slipped from my hand, landing face down in the dirt. Leave! The voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from the figure. I ran. Part 6: The Chase. I sprinted back the way I came, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the mist. My lungs burned as I pushed forward, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever I had seen in the clearing. The smell of decay clung to me, thick and nauseating, as though it was seeping into my skin. The mist seemed to close in tighter, blurring the trees into looming, indistinct shapes. My boots pounded against the ground, but the soil felt wrong, softer, stickier, as if it were trying to trap me. Behind me, the growl came again, deep and resonant, vibrating through the air like the sound of grinding stones. It was closer now. I didn't dare look back. The laughter returned, faint at first, but growing louder with every step. It echoed all around me, overlapping in disjointed waves, as if the forest itself was mocking my fear. The flashlight flickered. "No!" I gasped, shaking it as I ran. The beam dimmed, then surged back to life, but in that brief darkness, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, shadows darting through the trees, impossibly fast. The growl came again, sharper this time, almost a snarl. "Stay away!" I shouted, my voice breaking. Something snapped behind me, a branch, or maybe a bone. I didn't stop to check. My legs were trembling, my breath ragged, but I forced myself to keep moving. Then the ground changed. I stumbled as the soft soil gave way to something firmer, harder. My boots scraped against jagged stone, and I realized I was no longer on the path. I had veered off into unfamiliar terrain, the mist swallowing any sense of direction. Panic clawed at me. The flashlight beam swung left, right, searching for a way out, but all I could see were endless trees and thick, suffocating fog. A sharp sound cut through the air, like nails dragging across metal. I froze. Slowly I turned, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The mist shifted, parting just enough to reveal it. The figure from the clearing. It was closer now, no more than 20 feet away. Its outline was clearer, though still blurred at the edges, as if it didn't fully belong to this world. Its head jerked unnaturally, and its limbs moved in strange, disjointed motions, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. But it was the eyes that held me. Deep, empty voids that seemed to pull the light inward, swallowing it whole. "Leave!" it rasped, the word dragging out like a dying breath. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, rooted to the spot by a primal terror I couldn't shake. Then it took a step forward. And another. The flashlight flickered again, and when the light returned, the figure was gone. I spun around, desperate, and that's when I saw them. Handprints. Fresh, wet, and impossibly large, they were pressed into the stone all around me. And they were moving. Part 7, The Breathing Stone. The handprints weren't just moving, they were growing. Each impression in the stone expanded, the fingers elongating, twisting, until they resembled grotesque claws gouging into the earth. The stone beneath my feet vibrated faintly, as if something massive and alive was stirring just below the surface. I stumbled back, the flashlight darting in every direction. The mist thickened, swallowing the trees and the trail I thought I'd been following. The breathing of the stone wasn't loud, but it was tangible, like a pulse thrumming through the ground and up into my legs. I had to move. I picked a direction and ran, no longer caring where it led. The flashlight flickered and sputtered, casting erratic beams of light that only seemed to deepen the shadows. My boots scraped against the uneven surface, kicking loose shards of rock that clattered into the void. And then I felt it. A presence. Close. Too close. I stopped abruptly, the flashlight jerking to a halt in front of me. For a moment, there was nothing but the endless mist and the cold, silent void. And then I saw the first shape. A face, pale and childlike, materialized just beyond the edge of the beam. It was motionless, the features smooth and waxy, like a doll's head with hollow eyes staring blankly at me. Another face appeared to the left, then another to the right. Each one identical, each one frozen in that same eerie stillness. My breath caught in my throat. I took a shaky step back, and the faces moved. Not their features, their entire heads turned in unison, following me like grotesque sentinels. Their mouths began to part, slowly at first, until the edges of their lips cracked and split into gaping, jagged smiles. The laughter returned, but this time it wasn't coming from the mist. It was coming from them. I turned and ran, the sound of their laughter chasing me, overlapping in distorted waves. The flashlight flickered violently, and then it went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. "Damn it!" I shouted, smacking it with my hand. The light returned, faint and sputtering, just in time to reveal something ahead. A tree. But not just any tree. It was massive, its trunk gnarled and blackened, as if it had been scorched by fire. Its branches stretched unnaturally high, disappearing into the mist. The air around it was colder, heavier, and as I approached, I noticed something hanging from its limbs. Ribbons. Hundreds of them, fluttering faintly in the still air. Some were bright and fresh, others faded and torn, but they all shared one unsettling detail. They were tied into neat little bows, just like the one I'd found earlier. Beneath the tree, the ground wasn't stone or soil, it was bone. Skulls, ribs, and splintered fragments jutted out in all directions, forming a macabre carpet around the base of the trunk. And at the center of it all was a name, carved deep into the bark, jagged and uneven. Lila. A chill ran down my spine. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. Lila, I whispered, the name tasting bitter on my tongue. From somewhere behind me came a voice, soft and hollow. You shouldn't have come. Part 8. The Voices in the Tree. The voice was faint but sharp, like the hiss of air escaping a cracked pipe. It cut through the silence, wrapping around me like a cold hand gripping my throat. You shouldn't have come, it repeated. I turned, slowly this time, my flashlight trembling. The mist seemed thicker now, swirling and churning as though alive. Shapes moved within it, slender, shifting figures that melted into the fog the moment the light touched them. Who's there? I called out, my voice thin and brittle. Silence. Then the tree groaned. The sound was low and guttural, like the creak of an ancient door. I turned back, the flashlight beam locking on the tree's blackened trunk. Something was moving on its surface. At first, I thought it was the shadows playing tricks on me. But as I stepped closer, I saw them, faces. Dozens of them, their features warped and frozen in expressions of agony. They bulged from the bark as though straining to break free, their mouths contorted into silent screams. Eyes hollow and lidless stared out at me, accusing and desperate. Lila! One of the faces rasped, the bark splitting as it spoke. I stumbled back, tripping over the uneven ground. My hands hit something sharp, and I looked down to see a fractured skull staring back at me, its jaw twisted into a ghastly grin. The tree groaned again, louder this time, and a new face began to emerge from the trunk. The bark cracked and splintered as it took shape, a child's face, eerily familiar. It was her. The girl from the photograph. Her eyes opened slowly, blank and glassy, and her mouth moved as if trying to form words. When her voice came, it was soft, like a whisper carried on a dying breath. You need to leave, she said. I'm trying, I shouted, scrambling to my feet. Her face twisted, a look of terror crossing her features. You can't. Not now. A sharp crack split the air, and the ground beneath me began to shift. The bones scattered around the tree rattled and rolled, forming strange, spiraling patterns. The mist thickened, and the figures within it grew bolder, stepping closer. What do you mean I can't? I demanded, panic clawing at my throat. The girl's face distorted, her features stretching unnaturally. You let them see you. The figures in the mist moved closer. My flashlight flickered again, casting fleeting glimpses of long, spindly limbs and hollow, eyeless faces. They were closing in, their movements slow but deliberate. You have to make it to the gate, the girl's voice said, urgent now. Before they take you. My heart thundered in my chest. I turned, scanning the fog for any sign of the path I had taken. It was gone, swallowed by the mist. How do I find it? I yelled, my voice cracking. The girl's face began to dissolve back into the tree, her features melting into the bark. Her final words were barely audible. Run! I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted, the flashlight shaking violently in my hand. Behind me, the figures gave chase, their laughter splitting the air like jagged glass. The ground seemed to shift and pulse beneath my feet, the bones crunching loudly with every step. The mist clawed at me, cold and suffocating, as though trying to drag me back. The gate. I had to find the gate. Part 9. The Whispers in the Fog. The laughter followed me, sharp and broken, like shards of glass grinding against each other. My lungs burned as I ran blindly through the mist, each step feeling heavier than the last. The ground beneath me had turned slick, the jagged bones giving way to mud that sucked at my boots. I could hear them now, low, guttural whispers just beyond the edge of my vision. The figures in the mist were closing in, their shadows darting between the trees like predators. Faster! I muttered to myself, my voice trembling. You have to go faster! But the fog seemed alive, twisting and thickening, blocking any sense of direction. Every step felt like I was moving deeper into a labyrinth with no end. Then I saw it, a faint glimmer of light ahead, barely visible through the haze. The gate. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. A sharp sound, a wet, snapping noise came from behind me, followed by the thunderous crack of a tree falling. I turned just in time to see one of the figures fully emerge from the mist. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs long and angular like the branches of a dead tree. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a smooth, featureless mask, save for a wide, jagged mouth that seemed to split its head in two. Black ichor dripped from the corners of its grin, staining the ground as it moved toward me. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and distorted, filling my head like a swarm of insects. Leave, leave, leave! I stumbled backward, my flashlight jerking wildly as the beam caught the edges of more figures emerging from the mist. They moved in perfect unison, their jagged mouths opening and closing as they whispered. The gate was still ahead, but now it seemed farther away, as though the mist itself was stretching the distance. Get out! I growled, forcing my legs to move. I ran, ignoring the slick mud and the jagged rocks tearing at my boots. The whispers grew louder, rising to a deafening crescendo. Shadows flickered in the corner of my vision, but I didn't dare look. The light from the gate grew brighter, cutting through the mist like a beacon. My heart pounded as I drew closer, the twisted iron arch becoming clearer with every step. I was almost there. Then the ground gave way. I fell hard, the flashlight flying from my hand and skittering across the mud. Pain shot through my knees and palms as I scrambled to my feet, the whispers now a cacophony of screams. The flashlight's beam landed on something in front of me, and my blood turned to ice. The girl. Lila. She stood between me and the gate, her small figure partially obscured by the fog. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her face streaked with dirt and blood. She was holding the teddy bear, its fur matted and soaked. You can't leave, she said softly, her voice carrying over the chaos. What? I gasped, taking a step toward her. She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. They won't let you. The whispers stopped. Silence crashed over the forest like a wave, suffocating and absolute. Then came the laughter. It was loud now, impossibly loud, as if the entire world was laughing at me. Lila's face twisted into something grotesque, her glassy eyes rolling back as her mouth split into an impossibly wide grin. Behind her, the figures in the mist surged forward. Part 10. The Grinning Void. Lila's smile was wrong. It stretched far too wide, tearing her delicate skin until dark rivulets of blood ran down her chin. Her glassy eyes locked onto mine as her small body convulsed, her limbs jerking unnaturally like a marionette controlled by unsteady hands. Stay, she rasped, her voice layered with a dozen others, each tone more distorted than the last. Behind her, the figures surged forward. The flashlight's beam barely illuminated their twisted forms, but I could see enough: elongated limbs that bent at impossible angles, gaping mouths filled with rows of needle-like teeth, and hollow, eyeless faces that seemed to drink in the light. The gate was only a few steps away. I lunged for it, but the ground erupted beneath me. Black, sinewy tendrils shot out of the earth, wrapping around my ankles and yanking me down. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked from my lungs as I clawed at the mud, desperate to pull myself free. Lila stepped closer, dragging the teddy bear behind her. The sound of its wet, matted fur scraping across the ground sent a shiver down my spine. You can't leave, she whispered again, her voice soft yet deafening in the oppressive silence. The tendrils tightened, cold and slimy, digging into my skin. I kicked and thrashed, but they held firm, pulling me toward the figures that loomed ever closer. Their laughter grew louder, reverberating in my skull like the tolling of a broken bell. "Let me go!" I screamed, my voice hoarse. One of the figures reached out, its clawed hands stretching impossibly long. I felt its icy touch graze the back of my neck, and a wave of nausea rolled over me. My vision blurred, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I saw something. Not the forest, not the mist, but something else. Darkness. Endless, suffocating darkness filled with twisted, writhing shapes. The air was thick with the sound of wet, guttural screams, and the stench of decay was so strong it burned my throat. I was in a void, a place where nothing should exist, yet everything did. I snapped back to reality with a gasp, my hands clawing desperately at the mud. The gate was so close now, the iron arch shimmering faintly like a mirage. "Don't fight," Lila said, her head tilting unnaturally to the side. "It's easier if you don't fight." Her words ignited something in me, a primal, desperate need to survive. With a guttural yell, I reached for the flashlight, its beam flickering weakly in the mud. Gripping it tightly, I swung it at the tendrils, the impact sending a jolt up my arm. The tendrils recoiled with a shriek, their grip loosening just enough for me to scramble free. I didn't hesitate. I ran for the gate, my legs burning and my heart pounding like a war drum. The figures screamed behind me, their distorted voices rising in a crescendo of rage. The gate loomed ahead, its rusted iron bars shimmering in the pale light. As I reached it, I felt the air grow colder, the world around me vibrating with a low, resonant hum. "Don't look back," I muttered to myself, tears streaming down my face. I didn't. I threw myself through the gate, the world blurring into a rush of sound and light. And then silence. Part 11. The other side of the gate. When I hit the ground, the silence was overwhelming, like I'd been submerged in water. For a moment I didn't move, afraid to even open my eyes. My heart pounded against my ribs, the echoes of laughter and whispers still ricocheting in my skull. The air was different here. It was sharp and cold, but clean, free of the rotting stench that had suffocated me in the mist. I opened my eyes slowly, my vision swimming as I struggled to adjust. I was no longer in the forest. The gate stood behind me, its iron bars warped and blackened, almost skeletal. Beyond it, the mist churned violently, the shadows within twisting and writhing like trapped animals. The laughter had stopped, but the whispers lingered, faint and disjointed, seeping through the gaps in the gate. I crawled away, my limbs shaking. The ground beneath me was firm, solid stone dusted with frost. I forced myself to stand, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline as I turned to take in my surroundings. It was a clearing, but unlike any I'd seen before. The trees here were dead, their blackened branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The ground was uneven, cracked with deep fissures that exhaled faint tendrils of steam. And then I saw them. More shoes. They were scattered across the clearing, some half buried in the frost, others pristine and untouched. Unlike the spiral I had seen earlier, these were arranged in a haphazard, chaotic manner, as if they had been flung here by some unseen force. Each pair faced the gate. My stomach churned as I realized what they were, a tribute. An offering. I turned back to the gate, my breath catching as I saw the figures beyond. They pressed against the bars, their jagged mouths snapping soundlessly as their hollow faces stared at me. Their whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping until they became a single word. "Stay." I stumbled back, the flashlight's beam trembling as I pointed it toward the ground. The frost glimmered faintly, revealing a trail of footprints, small, delicate ones. Lila's. They led away from the gate, winding through the clearing toward a distant shape barely visible through the haze. It was a house. The structure was old and decrepit, its wooden boards warped and sagging under years of decay. Its windows were shattered, and its front door hung crookedly on rusted hinges. The roof sagged in the center, as if the house itself was too tired to stand. I knew I should run. I should leave this place, retrace my steps, and never look back. But the footprints pulled at me, tugging at some deep, unshakable part of my mind. I had to follow. My legs felt like lead as I crossed the clearing, the gate's whispers fading behind me. The house loomed larger with every step, its presence oppressive and suffocating. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the decaying wood. The air here was heavier, filled with an electric charge that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. "Lila?" I called out, my voice barely audible. No answer. I pushed the door open, the rusted hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the air was colder. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, threatening to collapse with every step. The walls were covered in crude drawings, etched into the wood with something sharp. They were childlike but disturbing, figures with hollow faces, jagged teeth, and wide, staring eyes. At the center of the room was a single chair. And on it sat the teddy bear. Part 12. The Truth in the Chair. The bear sat perfectly upright, its glassy eyes fixed on me. Its fur was even darker now, almost black, and the metallic smell of blood hung heavy in the air. I didn't move, my body frozen as though the air itself had become a cage. The chair creaked softly, as if the bear had shifted ever so slightly. "Lila," I whispered. My voice barely escaped my throat, but the name seemed to echo unnaturally in the empty house. A faint sound answered me, a giggle. It came from somewhere deeper in the house, light and childlike but wrong, distorted like a warped recording. My flashlight flickered as I turned toward the sound, my boots creaking against the uneven floorboards. "Lila?" I called again, louder this time. The giggle faded into silence, replaced by a faint rustling noise. It was coming from the walls, like dozens of tiny claws scuttling just beneath the surface. The drawings on the walls seemed to shift in the flickering light, the jagged figures growing sharper, their hollow faces turning toward me. "Why are you here?" a voice whispered, soft and brittle. I spun around, the flashlight sweeping over the room. There was no one there, just the bear, sitting silently on its throne. The floor beneath me groaned louder, and a sudden chill shot through the air. My breath turned to vapor as I took a hesitant step toward the chair. "You shouldn't have followed," the voice said again. This time it was closer, as though someone was standing right behind me. I turned sharply, my flashlight catching movement in the shadows. For a brief moment I saw her, Lila, standing at the edge of the room. Her small figure was pale and translucent, her wide eyes staring at me with a mix of fear and anger. "You can't fix this," she said, her voice trembling. "They won't let you." "Fix what?" I asked, my voice cracking. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised one trembling hand and pointed toward the chair. I turned back to the bear, my pulse thundering in my ears. Something glimmered beneath it, something metallic and familiar. The bracelet. I crouched slowly, my hand reaching out to grab it. The moment my fingers brushed the cool metal, the bear collapsed, its stuffing spilling onto the floor in a wet, red heap. And then I saw what was inside. Bones. Small, brittle, human bones tangled with dark, matted fur. My breath hitched as I stumbled back, my flashlight illuminating the grotesque scene. "They took me," Lila's voice said, trembling now. "And they'll take you too?" The walls began to shake, the drawings coming to life as the jagged figures twisted and writhed. The scuttling sound grew louder, merging into a deafening roar. "Run!" Lila screamed, her voice breaking. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted for the door, the house groaning and buckling around me. The walls seemed to close in, the jagged figures reaching out with clawed hands. The moment I crossed the threshold, the house collapsed behind me with a thunderous crash. Dust and debris filled the air, but I didn't stop running. The gate was visible again, its iron bars standing ominously in the distance. The whispers returned, louder now, their disjointed voices clawing at my mind. As I reached the gate, I glanced back one last time. The mist had swallowed the clearing, but for a brief moment, I saw her, Lila, standing amidst the rubble of the house, her glassy eyes watching me. She raised her hand slowly, and for a fleeting second I thought she smiled. Then she was gone. I stepped through the gate, collapsing onto the dirt path on the other side. The mist receded instantly, as if it had been waiting for me to leave. The air was lighter, warmer, and the oppressive silence was replaced by the faint rustle of leaves. I turned back toward the gate, but it was no longer there. Just an empty, overgrown field. And in the dirt, where the gate had once stood, was a single, small handprint. The end.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, and don't miss the next scary stories. Bye-bye.